Hello everyone and welcome back to our town. So it is now the 1950s and that is about 50 million people in the country, and it was a time between the Second World War and the start of the Cold War where people were quite conformative. There were strict sort of gender roles and societal expectations. It kind of went a little bit backwards. Kind of people didn't really wanted to find their place again after the between the two sort of major things. They wanted to build peace and prosperity in society. In society in general, there were quite a lot of clashes between the communists and the capitalists. Obviously, this culminated in the Cold War activities, even though Britain didn't participate in it as much as America did, but there was still a few odd bits and bobs to do with that during this century. We also have the Korean Wars at the beginning of this era as well, from 50 to 53. Obviously UK played some part of it, but obviously it was more the US. We also have the space race between the US and Russia as well, and we also have the beginnings of the teenager and all the culture and fashion and more free time and stuff for them. It's sort of starting to shape the different sort of landscape for them, especially in the next era as well. So weather-wise in the UK, it was a bit of a ups and downs. We had like record highs of 34.4 centigrade in the summers, and we had one of the worst winters on record in 52. And we also had things like the North Sea floods in 53 that killed over 107 people. We also had hurricanes from Europe, and because of all the hot summers, we had thunderstorms and extreme heavy rain in the north as well. So it was either thunderstorming in the north or your roads were cracking due to the heat in the south. So it's pretty much how it can be some years. In terms of money, there's not much happening. It was still recovering after the depression in the 30s, but not really doing anything significant at the beginning of this era. We start off with about 8 to 9% of interest, and then by the end it dropped to about 1 to 3%, which is still a lot better than it is today. God damn it, no one can save anymore. There are lots of scientific stuff going on during the 50s. Obviously technology getting better. We have people like Francis Crick and James Watson discovering double helix for DNA. We had the polio vaccine. We had ultrasound tests. We also had the formation of CERN, which was started off as being for all the nuclear and particle physics sort of development to make sure that people weren't doing anything stupid. And we also had the first nuclear power stations, and we have NASA as well, obviously, to help with all the space stuff and all the stuff that they were going to come up with. We also had the first transistor computer in 1953 from Manchester University, and we also had hydrogen bomb tests as well, which we will find out how the UK set off during our fun facts thing. Music became a lot more diverse during the 50s as well. We obviously still had some jazz and stuff, but we had the introduction of rock and roll, especially in America. So we had people like Frank Sinatra and Nat King Cole and James Brown from the jazz world, and then we had people like Elvis Presley and Johnny Nash that sort of translated over to the UK. And TV wise, it was a golden age for television. There was a lot of rise in sales of television, especially here in the UK. Obviously, we have the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, who is still our queen, and lots of people went off to buy televisions with that. There were a lot more films as well, especially more like European and Japanese films being recognised in their own languages as well. We also had 3D cinematography, making actual 3D sort of landscapes and stuff, not as in 3D as we know it at to this day, not the IMAX. In art, we had abstract expressionism. We got your boy Jackson Pollock for doing all of his lovely splatting paintings and stuff. Maybe because he was inspired by all the nuclear fusion and hydrogenness. Or maybe he was just a bit high on his paints, which is probably the more likely reason. We also had the beginnings of the pop art movement as well, which we will hear a little bit more about, especially in Britain in the 60s. That kind of movement kind of defined that era. And in fashion, there was obviously a lot of influences in the rock and roll movement. We had the Teddy Boys over here in the UK. Obviously in the US they were called the Greasers. They were slightly more rebellious, especially with the teenage sort of styles coming in. They're a bit more overtly sexual as well, wearing tight trousers and tight-waisted things. Obviously had people like Marilyn Monroe and all that type of thing influencing people. We also had top designers like Christian Dior introducing the HA and Y line for designing the different shapes, and we had Coco Chanel with her classic pearl earrings, pearl necklaces, and unique tweed designs that was famous for. So now we get on to the architecture of this decade. So we still had our traditional town expansions with our semi-detached houses and detached houses, but it was slowly becoming a decline in this traditional way of making houses, and people were opting for the higher rise buildings, flats and maisonettes and stuff as well. Instead of expanding the town outwards, they thought, especially in more densely populated areas, that the town should expand upwards instead. So in the 50s they kind of built more 4-story high buildings, and they were kind of in shapes of T's and Y's, and obviously beautiful big boxes as well. Most of these actually can be still seen about, especially if you're in a more built up area, especially in London and Coventry and all sorts of stuff like that. And this type of high rise kind of came to known as the Brutalist style of architecture, and this was about from 1951 to 1975. It was coined from the French béton brut, even though that sounded a bit Scottish, or raw concrete, as I think it's roughly translated to. This was coined by architects Allison and Peter Smithson in 1954. They were stark and striking tower blocks, and they had large sections of exposed concrete. So basically it's a big concrete box that people lived in. The concrete did allow them some flexibility when they were building it, so they could obviously make it a lot cheaper, and it was long lasting. Obviously the style of it was a very big visual disturbance to some people, and had a lot of impact on the surrounding area and the landscape of towns, and because they were huge buildings sometimes, so the sheer mass of them and all the rough grey concrete colour kind of didn't make people very happy about them, but some people absolutely loved them. And it's all about opinion with brutalist architecture. They also had sort of some, if you were lucky, some of them actually had walls that were filled with abstract designs in their tiles and random stonework or coloured plastics and stuff, especially inside. And they had large windows that kind of went across near enough the whole of the side of the building, and they'd have little shallow balconies as well. Sometimes you'd be able to go on them and sometimes you wouldn't be able to. They also had sort of flying sections and corridors that were sometimes used for like services, for like laundry bits, or they could be used for like stairwells and stuff. And probably later on when we get to the lift technology, then they would probably put lifts and stuff in them as well. So some key buildings about, if you're out and about, that are in the Brutalist style is the Terelic Tower, and that's in London, the Royal Festival Hall. We have the University of East Anglia halls of residence as well, which I've actually seen. They are quite interesting. And we've got large parts of the Midlands as well that were bombed out, like Coventry Cathedral was completely destroyed, and then they built a massive grey concrete cathedral out of the ruins of the actual cathedral, which is rather interesting as well. We obviously have the Barbican as well, which is one of the probably the most famous brutalist architect buildings in the UK. And during this time, it was kind of, they had a bridge that spanned all the way from the festival hall all the way over to the Barbican, so you'd never have to walk on the pavement at all. It was a completely raised bridge that went between all the buildings, and it was kind of playing into some utopian ideal of like everyone being together in one place, making their own little community in the tower blocks and making it seem a little bit nicer than it actually was. With the building of the Royal Festival Hall was actually for the Festival of Britain, and that was in 1951. Obviously the Royal Festival Hall is located on the South Bank near Waterloo, but the festival actually spanned all around the country, from Scotland, Wales and everywhere. Got involved, showing off different arts, designs, music, drama, architecture, town planning, science and technology, all to promote Britain and the products we could make. I feel like this, it would be a good time to have another Festival Britain when we if and ever leave the Europe, which is always fun. So there's lots of fun things. A lot of their design and stuff at this time was inspired by science, and sort of the patterns you get at this time can be derived from sort of like nuclear stuff and sort of scientific cells and pictures and stuff like that. If you've ever seen some of the wallpapers and stuff or designs from the Festival of Britain, they all have a little bit of a flavour of science to them, and obviously a lot of pastel colours and all sorts of stuff like that. So some fun facts of the 50s. So in 1950 we had the UK hosted the World Figure Skating Championships. We also had Rover cars, we had the first Silverstone Grand Prix, we also had the first package holiday that people went on, we also had the first purpose-built Sainsbury's superstore, we also had the first Kenwood chef mixer sold, and the Chronicles of Narnia books were also published at this time. In 1951 they introduced the X rating for films in Britain, so you had to be 16 plus to watch them, so it'd be basically what R15 is now. And the radio show The Archers started as well, and if you tune into BBC Radio 4 in an afternoon and hear the classic tune, The Archers is still going strong. We also had the first Miss World, and that was at the Festival of Britain as well. We also had the introduction of zebra crossings. So they're the ones with the stripes on the road and the big lollipops sticks either end. We also had the book The Day of the Triffids published as well, a classic book of the plants taking over the earth. Lots of apocalyptic dystopian books published at this time due to all the lovely nuclear testing. In 1952, speaking of nuclear testing, UK had its first atomic bomb, and we had the Great Smog of London, which covered the entire London for a few years. We also had the Clean Airs Act as well, and over nearly 4,000 people were claimed to die because of the smog. In 1953, we had the first James Bond novel, Casino Royale, published. We also had the first Italian espresso bar, so it's not a new thing. Classic Neuros back in the 53. We also had 25% of people in the UK had a television by this point, and that would increase obviously. And by 54, we had shown and proven a link between smoking and getting lung cancer. The first Lord of the Rings book was published, and obviously the later ones obviously published as well. We also had the first purpose-built comprehensive school in Greenwich, and I bet that is probably still standing today and probably looks horrendous because it would have been in the Brutalist architecture. And we also had the Lord of the Flies book published as well. In 1955, we had Severe Gales that swept topsoil across Norfolk. Classic bit of soil dispersion. We also had the film Dam Busters, and we had the first ever Guinness Book of Records. The first fish fingers were produced by Birdseye as well. In 1956, the introduction of double yellow lines were introduced in Slough, of all places, so this prohibits you to park. We also had the first UK albums chart and the first Tesco's, which was a self-service store, because before then you would go into a grocery store and the person working there would go get your things off the shelf behind them. So this was the first one where you could go around and pick your stuff yourself, and I think the first two were in St Albans and Malden as well, classic Malden. And in 57, we had a BBC Panorama episode where they exposed Switzerland for growing spaghetti on trees, and this was actually a April Fool's joke, as it was shown on the 1st of April. And we also had the first ever British car to win a Formula 1 championship, and we also had the first Christmas message from the Queen as well, and obviously she is still doing her Christmas message every year. In 1958, we had the first parking meters installed, which was a terrible idea, and why did they ever do that? And we had the Notting Hill race riots as well. There's a lot of different cultures were coming over at this time, and from the West Indies, and obviously from India as well. So there was a lot of tensions between these two groups. We also had our first British Formula 1 champion as well, and sadly in the year after he managed to drive his Jaguar XF into a tree on the A3 near my town and sadly passed away. We also had the Expo for Computers as well, which was the first of its kind in the world. And in 59, we had the first ever journey by a hovercraft, which you can actually still go on this journey. It's from Portsmouth to the Isle of Wight if you're ever down by the coast. We also had the introduction of UK postcodes as well. This was first trialled out in classic topsoil Norfolk. We also had the first ever section of the M1 motorway open between Watford and Rugby, and it would be later extended to Edgware and someone up north. Because it links London all the way up to Edinburgh. And we had 30% of people in Britain owning a car. So I will leave you now with a tour of how our town has changed through this era, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.